chapter 2. Now, this is considered Mishnah 8 by the Kahati. In the Sidur, actually, they differentiate between the first part of Mishnah 8 and the rest of Mishnah 8. I will do that because I'd like to give an introduction on Yohanan ben Zakai. So we'll do what's in the Mishnah, the first part of Mishnah 8, and continue it next week. And in some places, they actually, like in the Sidur, they do put it into two parts. So Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakai received from Hillel and Shammai, and this is what I said earlier, that this appears to be a continuation of, it really probably should be right after Hillel and Shammai, which is in chapter 1, because you have sayings of Hillel, sayings of Shammai, until chapter 1, Mishnah 15, and all of a sudden you have Rabban Gamliel. And actually, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai for a short time becomes the Nasi, becomes the president after Rabban Gamliel passes away, right before the destruction of the temple. So here when it says Hillel and Shammai, Yochanan ben Zakai received from Hillel and Shammai, it really should be there in chapter 1. I stated a few times already that it looks like that there was an attempt to put in the family lineage of the Nasi'im, of the presidents, all the way up to Yudah Nasi and his son, before getting back to this. So as you can see in chapter 2, you have Rebbe, you have Yudah Nasi, his son, Rabban Gamliel, and then you have sayings in the name of Hillel again, and then we have Yochanan ben Zakai. So it seems that there's an attempt to create this lineage of this house of Hillel into the lineage of Yudah Nasi and his son, and then back to the student of Hillel and Shammai, Yochanan ben Zakai. Now, Rav Yochanan ben Zakai is a very central figure in Jewish history. As you remember, the way the story is told in the tractate of Gittin, in the 5th chapter. So on the eve of the destruction of the temple, there are a few places where the Talmud says that Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai saw it coming, that the temple would be destroyed. Sometimes when you understand the social interaction of people and of factions within society, so sometimes the writing is on the wall. And that's why it's very important, as it says, Ezeu Chacham Haroet HaNolad. It's the wise man who's able to see how our actions of today are going to affect the future. That's called Roet HaNolad. And the Talmud also says Chacham Adif Minavi, that a real wise person is better than a prophet, because a prophet can only see what God shows him in the future, or her. But a wise man can infer lots of things that are going to happen in the future, and not just specific events. Ezeu Chacham Haroet HaNolad, who can see how future events are being revealed to us through the present. And by the way, in the Hebrew language, a midwife is called Chachama. And even the Onkelos translates into Aramaic when he talks about Shifra and Pua, who are the famous Hebrew midwives in Egypt. He calls them Chakimaya. And they're actually called in the verse Chachamot, Ki Chachamoten, which means, so Chachamot, why? Why are they called women of wisdom, midwives? Because they can see the child being born. They can understand what's going to come in the future. And that's the definition of being wise, somebody who can read the present and understand how the future will unfold based on the present. So Yochanan ben Zakai was one of these people. And the Talmud says about Yochanan ben Zakai that he was among 80 pupils of Hillel who Ru'yim Lizkot He's one of the 80 students of Hillel that deserve to receive the holy presence, which means revelation in some sense of Ruach HaKodesh, if their generation would have been able to, because you can't just have Hillel too. It says that he should have had the divine presence upon him like prophecy, but his generation was not worthy of such. So it says that Yochanan was the least among Hillel's 80 pupils. So I'll read you in the Hebrew what it says. It says about Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai that Lo iniach mikra, He did not leave, okay, I'll read in English, it's just easier. So he did not leave unstudied the Bible, the Mishnah, the Gemara, the Halacha, the Agadah, all the exegetical details of the Torah and the scribes, and analogies and computations and gematria, and even the speech of administering angels of spirits of palm trees, parables, fox parables, and any matter great and small. So out of the 80 students of Hillel, it says the greatest among them was Yonatan ben Azil, and the least among them was Yochanan ben Zakai, but this was a man who studied so much, he had a full understanding both of Torah and of nature around him. Now, this Yochanan ben Zakai, as I said before, was the one who establishes Kerem B'Yavne after the destruction of the temple. And we know the story. Abba Sikra. Yes. Okay, so the head of the militants was Abba Sikra. And Abba Sikra was the nephew of Yochanan ben Zakai. Now, Abba Sikra, the militants didn't allow anybody to leave the city so that they shouldn't speak to the Romans. And the story is that Yochanan ben Zakai realized that he has to speak to the Romans. He has to see if he can salvage something. And so he met with his nephew and he said, look, I want to speak with the Romans. So Abba Sikra says, I understand you, but I can't authorize it. What am I supposed to do? So he says, tell me what to do. So Abba Sikra says, okay, I'll tell you what to do. Tell your students that you're not feeling well. Then let the word known that you're sick. And then let the word known that you died. We can bury people outside the city and then do whatever you feel has to be done. But I can't change what got involved in. So Yochanan says, fine, that's what I'll do. So he told two of his close students that he wasn't feeling well. Then he told them to tell everybody he was sick. And then he worked out a sort of like a program with them, what they were going to do, strategy. And then they said he died. And they put him into a coffin. And after there was Levaya, they started taking him out of the city. And then the Jewish militants who saw him at the gate said, what are you doing? He said, we're bringing the body of our rabbi to be buried outside the city. He said, how do we know he's dead? He says, what does that mean? He says, well, we'll put a sword in it just in case. He says, you're going to put a sword in the rabbi's body? He says, okay, we'll just tumble it, shake it up and down. How about that? He said, oh, come on, that's ridiculous. So they said, okay, just go bury him. So they took him outside of the gates. As soon as they walked outside the gates out of eyesight, so they opened up the casket, and Yochanan got up and walked towards the Roman camp. And that was the camp of Aspasianus, of Vespasian, who at that time was a top general of the Romans. And he comes into Vespasian's camp and he says, I need to speak to him, I have a message. So, okay, Vespasian says, what's the message? He says, Yochanan says, well, first of all, I'd like to greet you, Caesar. Vespasian says, I'm not Caesar. He says, you deserve the death penalty for that. Yochanan says, you must be Caesar, because Jerusalem would only fall in the hands of a Caesar. So Vespasian says, that's what you're saying is, that's mutinous. You're not allowed to say things like that. As they're having their discussion, an emissary comes from Rome and runs in and says, Vespasian, we have a letter for you. Gives him a letter. The letter says Caesar just died and the Senate in Rome has decided you're the next Caesar. Vespasian looks at Yochanan. He says, I don't know how you knew this, but I'm in a good mood. Ask me for whatever you want, I'll give it to you. Whatever you came for, you can have it. Yochanan says, I came for three things. Vespasian says, what are they? He says, number one, I want you to give me an academy in Yavne so that we can have Torah scholars studying there in the town of Yavne. Vespasian says, fine, you can have it. He says, I also want the family of the Gamliels, the high priest, the head of the Sanhedrin. I want the family members so they can teach in that academy. He says, fine. He says, I also want the family of Tzadok, the high priest, so that they can also continue even outside Jerusalem. And Vespasian says, that's okay. All three are granted. That's it. As the story is being told in the tractate of Gittin, Rabbi Akiva quotes the verse, Meshiv chachamim achor v'da'atam yisakel. Sometimes even wise men act in stupidity. Why didn't he ask for Jerusalem? No answer is given. Of course, we can assume that he knew that he wouldn't get it, and therefore he didn't ask for it, especially after there had been a siege for so long over Jerusalem. But after the destruction of the temple, Yavne, Kerem B'Yavne, becomes the academy, which saves, you might say, at least Torah scholarship in Israel with the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, this doesn't mean, because Yohanan saw Jerusalem, the destruction coming, it does not mean he was not against it. And it doesn't mean that he wouldn't have battled if he thought there was a way of saving the day. He would have. And the story is told that when the temple was destroyed, this is told in Avot Rabbi Natan. It says, Rabbi Gamliel sat and watched in the direction of the walls of Jerusalem to learn what was happening, just like Eli, the high priest in the book of Samuel, sat waiting for the Ark of the Covenant to return. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai saw the temple was destroyed, and the oracle, the Heichal, was burning. He rent his garments. He took off his tefillin because he used to wear it all day. He sat weeping, and all his pupils did the same. Because the cessation of the temple service is one of the three things that keep the world going. Torah, Avodah, Gemilut Chasadim. And one other thing. The Talmud says in Brachot, a story about the last days of Yochanan ben Zakai, Brachot 28b, says when he fell ill, his disciples came to visit him. When Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai saw them, he began to weep. And his disciples said, Light of Israel, pillar of the right hand, mighty hammer, why are you weeping? He replied, if I had been taken today before a human king, who is here today and tomorrow in the grave, which he had actually been before, whose anger, if he's angry with me, it doesn't last forever. If he imprisons me, it's not forever. If he puts me for death, it's not everlasting death. And I can persuade him with words, I can bribe him with money, because he did persuade with words the first one. Even so, I would weep. But now that I'm being taken before the Supreme King of Kings, who lives and endures forever, whose anger can be everlasting. If he imprisons me, I'm imprisoned forever. If he puts me for death, that's it. I cannot persuade him with words or bribe him with money. And in addition, there are two ways before me. One leading to paradise, Gan Eden, and one to Gehinnom, and I do not know which one I am going to be taken to. Shall I not weep? Is it possible? Okay. At the moment of death, he said to his disciples, remove the vessels so that they shall not be unclean, and prepare a throne for Hezekiah, the king of Judah, who has come to accompany me into the next world. So Rabbi Tzvi Yehuda Kook used to explain on this passage, what does it mean Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakai is weeping because he doesn't know which way he's going to go, whether he's going to go to heaven or hell, to Gan Eden or Gehinnom. He doesn't know where he's going. The man who saved the study of Torah after the destruction of Jerusalem and rebuilt the rabbinic academies. What is that all about? Rav Tzvi Yehuda Kook explained was that the question that Rabbi Akiva asked in the 2nd century about Rabbi Yochanan, Yochanan asked himself in the first century when he walked away from Vespasian and wondered, he was such in a good mood, what would have happened if I would ask for Jerusalem? He never knew. He never got an answer. And this burned in his mind and in his heart for the rest of his life. Maybe I made a mistake. Maybe I could have asked for something else. Why did I ask just for those three things? And maybe because of that, I was a bad emissary and I will be punished and I will be brought into Gehinnom. I don't know. But at that last moment, before his departure from this world, when he tells the students to take out the vessels so they don't become impure from his deceased body, he sees a vision of Hezekiah, the king of Judah, coming to accompany him. And if you remember Hezekiah, during his lifetime, Jerusalem was saved from the Assyrian army, Aram, which wanted to destroy Jerusalem after they destroyed the northern kingdom. And God saved Jerusalem under Hezekiah. So Hezekiah knew one or two things about saving Jerusalem, and he comes to meet Yohanan, meaning that, Yohanan, you did what you could for the city in order to comfort him. So these statements of Yochanan ben Zakai, and also by the way, one last thing about Yochanan, which is interesting. Just like Hillel, and just like Moses, and just like Akiba, it says of Yochanan ben Zakkai that he lived 120 years. Now, the Bible says that Moses lived 120 years, but the oral tradition says that Hillel and Akiva and Yochanan ben Zakkai lived for 120 years. It says for the first 40 years he was in business, then another 40 years he studied Torah, and the last 40 years he taught. This is the Sifra on Devarim 357 and the Talmud Rosh Hashanah 31b. So Yochanan ben Zakkai is really a major personality in Jewish history. Because of him, it's a slight ray of hope with the destruction of the temple in an otherwise desperate situation for the Jewish people. And what is his thought? What is he going to do now that there's no temple and there is no basically works of the priesthood in the temple? There is no Jewish sovereignty and no king. What is left? If there are three pillars upon the world, what the world stands, as we had in chapter 1, ala Torah, ala avodah, val gmilut chasadim. So avodah was the temple service. It now turns to prayer because there is no more temple service. There still is Torah, even though the Sanhedrin has been persecuted and keep going north even before the destruction of the temple. It was expelled northwards to the Galil by the Romans. And Gmilut Chasadim, to help, to do charity, to do good deeds, that we can still do. So Yochanan now puts the main axis, the main emphasis on the axis of Torah. This is what is going to hold us together. We don't have the temple. We don't have our national unifying factor, which is the king. So we have still the Sanhedrin left over. And according to many, after the destruction of the temple, Yochanan ben Zakkai decided not to become the president of the Sanhedrin, but to leave it to the family of Hillel, who do continue as the presidents of the Sanhedrin for a few more hundred years after that. Instead, he builds out Pirkei Avot, and he remains there for 10 years until his death. He dies about 10 years after the destruction of the temple. But in Pirkei Avot, they rebuild the world of Torah. And this is best explained in his statement here, in this beginning of the Mishnah, which is Mishnah 9 in chapter 2. Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakai, he received from Hillel and Shammai. But remember, Hillel and Shammai, if Yohanan ben Zakai lived so many years, Hillel and Shammai is the beginning of the 1st century, well before the destruction of the Second Temple. Hu haya omer, he used to say, Im lamadeta Torah habe, if you have studied much Torah, al tachazik tova latzmecha. Don't feel so great about it. Don't think that you're such a great person. Because for this reason were you created. Now this is interesting. The human being, the Jew, is created to study Torah. What about the mitzvah? What about the temple? What about everything else? Is it just about the study of Torah? Now, before I go into that question and try to answer it, I want to point out two things here. One is the relationship between this Mishnah and the previous one. There is one. We had an unusual Mishnah before, number 7, about marbeh. If you have a lot, marbeh basar, marbeh rimah, if you have a lot of food, if you have a lot of property, if you have a lot of women, right? It was talking about before, and then it said if you have a lot of Torah, and there were 5 negative things, and then 5 positive things, marbeh Torah, marbeh chayim. If you have a lot of Torah, you have life. Here he's saying, Im lamada Torah harbe, it's the same word, marbeh, don't think it's such a big deal. Meaning, that's what you're supposed to do. Yes, Torah brings life, but that's what you're supposed to be doing. Also, the word notzarta. In Hebrew, there are 2 words for created. There's barata, which is very often translated like by Avraham Ibn Ezra as creation, something from nothing, ex nihilo. And then there's yatzar, which means to create something from something. So, if you look at these statements, it says, Im lamata Torah harbe, and the word harbe, in my opinion, is purposely, the previous Mishnah has this marbeh, because they wanted to put it before the harbe. And secondly, it says, kilachach notzarta. You were created to study Torah, but the word is yitzirah. Now there's 2 statements about man in Genesis 1 and 2. Number 1 is vayivra. It does say God creates, for the word bara, something from nothing, man in his image. Vayivra Elohim et Adam b'tzalmo. God created man in his image. B'tzelem Elohim bara oto. So when it talks about man being creating the image of God, it uses the term bara. But then it says in chapter 2, Vayitzer Hashem Elohim et Adam afar min ha'adama vayipach ba'apav nishmat chayim, that God created man, and there word uses the word Vayitzer, which is to formulate, formated man, if you want to, formed man. Afar min ha'adama, from the ground, vayipach ba'apav nishmat chayim, and he gave him the breath of life. The Talmud says about the word Vayitzer, it reminds us the word Yetzer, which is an inclination, to tell us that mankind has 2 inclinations, to do good and to do evil. In my opinion, he's using the word here, notzarta, because of that rabbinic understanding of the word Vayitzer. Meaning, because man has the ability of good and evil, you need Torah. So this idea that you were created, Vayitzer, in order to use the Torah, because of the fact that human beings have the possibility of good and evil, they need the Torah. So as Jews, we shouldn't take credit for the fact we're studying Torah. We're doing something to counteract the fact that we were created with the possibility of good and evil in order to push us into the line of good. That's the notzarta, not barata. But there's something else that has to be mentioned here. The world stands on 3 things, the Mishnah says. In Pirkei Avot, in chapter 1, Torah is one of the 3. Avodah, the worship of God, or the worship in the temple, is number 2. Gimilut chasadim, doing good deeds, like the mitzvot of the Torah, doing good deeds and doing charity and helping. There are 3 things, and these encompass different areas of life. What does it mean that studying Torah is now the central focus? We do find this. We do find this in rabbinic thinking, this idea of the emphasis on the study of Torah. Because as the Jews are going to the diaspora, they need to re-emphasize and use Torah as what I call the saving line, that which is going to save the Jewish people from the drowning waters of the diaspora, is understood early on by Yohanan ben Zakai. This is going to be even more emphasized by the Babylonian scholars in the Gemara. We're going to see even reinterpret the images of our favorite biblical personalities as Torah scholars, like King David, who, yes, he wrote the Tehillim, or at least most of it according to the Talmud. Others were collection. But he was also a king, and he also fought battles, and he was a national leader of the Jewish people. But the Talmud describes him as somebody sitting in the Beit Midrash and studying Torah. Because the Talmud is going to try to reinterpret the same thing about Joshua. Talmud is going to say that when Joshua meets this angel as he's about to enter the land of Israel, the angel is wondering, did you study Torah last night in the camp? So without going to the question of whether this is pshat or not, the Midrash is trying to intensify the need for Torah in order to survive the diaspora. We need the Torah, because that will give us purpose. It will give us direction. The more Jews become knowledgeable and educated, the more chance they have of surviving the diaspora. When they lose that knowledge and education, the winds of change will affect them more. And the truth is that this is even true coming back to the land of Israel. The more that we are embedded within our understanding of what it means to be a Jew, and this understanding comes through the knowledge of the Torah, the more we will be able to deal with the winds of change that hit us even in the land of Israel. This Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakai understood early on. And the continuation of this Mishnah will talk about how he sees his various students in their relationship to Torah, because he's going to try to train a cadre of new rabbinic leaders who will survive this unknown exile, because it just started. And Yohanan ben Zakai, with great trepidation and great uncertainty, is going to train these new rabbinic leaders to be teachers in an unknown world that eventually will move the Jews to Babylonia, but survive because somebody early on realized that Torah study could be that secret of Jewish life and longevity and continuity, despite the fact that it seemed that everything was lost. We will continue this next week. Shalom, shalom.